Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Here tonight, we're going to be talking about the new rhetoric, which, is it still new? Is it still new? It's tough to call something new, name something new. Put that in the brand. Can it stay new? Well, I think, I've kind of come around on this, and as I said the last time I was reading this book, I think there is some new stuff here. Or it can be made new again by thinking about it a little bit differently. So, happy to have you here with me tonight. And, we're going to get started momentarily in a little bit. But I thought I might just kind of talk a little bit about the plan for what I'm going to do tonight. Give you a heads up about it. It's going to be a little bit different than what I usually do, where I just kind of read through a whole section that I'm doing. But tonight I'm making up for the sins of my past, where I didn't finish doing the section that I wanted to do last time I did this, and someone reminded me of this. So I'm going to finish doing sections 6 and 7, which are pretty substantial themselves, about persuading and convincing and the universal audience. But then I'm going to go and move to, hopefully, if my energy doesn't flag, the second part of the book, the analysis of argumentation, and read some of those sections, about 6 sections, about 15 to 20. That's kind of my plan for tonight, so I hope I can do that. And as always, if you're here, whether you're here randomly or you're here from a class that I teach, feel free to, at any point, throw stuff in the chat and I'll take a look and we can kind of have a conversation that way. So, section 6, persuading and convincing. We have said enough to show that audiences are almost infinite in their variety. And in the effort to adapt to their particular characteristics, a speaker faces innumerable problems. You're telling me. This is one reason, perhaps, why there is such a tremendous interest in a technique of argumentation that would apply to all kinds of audiences, or at least to those composed of competent or rational people. Don't tell me how to do it, in your town. Tell me how to do it anywhere. I want the universal tricks of how to do this, or universal method if you have a different attitude towards it, corresponding to this ideal, to this desire to transcend historical or local particularities. So that theses or premises, you might say, sentences, positions defended may win universal acceptance, is the quest for objectivity, whatever the nature of this may be. In this endeavor, as Husserl says in a moving speech in which he defends the efforts of Western rational thought, we are in our philosophical work the public servants of mankind. It's probably not the kind of thing people would do today. But, if you look down here at the footnote, the crisis of European science, or of European knowledge, you might say something like this. This is a crisis way back in, maybe the 20s when he gave this speech. So it wasn't like a moment where they were just like, yay, go us. It was like, how do we really deal with what we now understand about knowledge and science, and what was the place of rationality? This is continually kind of a crisis all the way through the 20th century. Even for people who are defending it, they're like, there's a crisis here. It's kind of not how, if you go to an airport today, you go to the bookstore there's going to be a whole section. If there's any books on things like philosophy or anything like that, there'll be books like Reason 2.0 or The Age of Reason Returned. It'll be very kind of triumphant, a triumphant narrative. It's weird that we've come back to that. That's a kind of very popular story to tell, that reason has triumphed. That wasn't the feeling of people who were really interested in defending a tradition of reason. They were like, it's not easy to do that. There's a lot of things that are complex about that, internally, and so on. Okay. In the same spirit, J. Benda, Julien, I think, is the J, accuses clerks. Here, this is really intellectuals. They just don't really translate the English here very well. The word here is really the intellectuals. Accuse intellectuals of treason when they turn from concern with what is eternal and universal to defense of temporal and local values. That would be a really weird, this could be something in maybe the movie Clerks, where a customer comes in and accuses Jay and Silent Bob of not doing what is universal or eternal. But here they're talking about intellectuals. And this was a kind of criticism of a French intellectual at the time, in the 20s, and this is the 20s, who was saying that a lot of intellectuals were becoming nationalistic and racist, and this was no good. And what's one of the weird things here is that for him, what was the alternative that was eternal and universal? I think today it kind of is flipped in our minds. If someone's going around talking about the eternal and universal, they might be kind of more defending a position that might look nationalistic or even racist. And the story of why that maybe those attitudes have shifted is too complicated to get into, but it's weird to find these moments when you read an older text. One of the reasons to read these older texts is to be like, oh yeah, actually a lot more stuff is local in particular than I thought. It's kind of weird that the people who were championing the kind of universal were the people that were criticizing other people for being, racists. The woke people were all like, universal, let's go. Weird. Here is resumed that age-old debate between those who stand for truth and those who stand for opinion, between philosophers seeking the absolute and rhetors involved in action. It is out of this debate that the distinction between persuading and convincing seems to arise. We wish to reconsider this distinction in the context of a theory of argumentation and of the role by certain audiences. And you might be like, age-old dispute, I've never heard of it. I've never heard your name before. What are you talking about? What's this age-old dispute? But I would say that it's within the tradition of philosophy. And again, this is where especially Chaim Perlman is coming from, a tradition of philosophy. That philosophy, you could say, kind of gets defined or begins in its reaction against rhetoric, because the earliest philosophical documents that we have that are kind of complete, we have fragments of other things before this, these kind of complete philosophical works, where the word philosophy first really appears, I think, is Plato's dialogues, Plato's Socratic dialogues. And a lot of those dialogues are arguing against rhetoricians or sophists. A huge amount of them are. He's weirdly obsessed. He can't get over it. And then later on, philosophy is like, what is rhetoric? They don't think about it anymore. So it's weird to think that philosophy begins with this extreme concern of distinguishing philosophy from rhetoric. And then it gets, today it's like not really a concern. Philosophers don't really think about rhetoric. It's like that meme where Don Draper's in the elevator and the rhetorician's like, I think you're a jerk. I think you got everything wrong for 2,500 years. And then philosophy is like, I don't think about you at all. That's kind of the situation that we're in. And so here, Chaim Perlman and Lucy Albrecht-Titica they're an embassy to the philosophers, being like, actually, maybe there's something to be said for this other way of approaching these questions. So, but they kind of find this weird middle ground, one that I think has been pretty much confused both by the philosophical camp and by the rhetorical camp who read this work. So let's see what we make of it as we kind of go through in these two sections. To the person concerned with results, persuading surpasses convincing, since conviction is merely the first stage in progression toward action. Like, I really actually want to persuade you. Convincing you is like, who cares? Let's keep going. We got to do something here. Rousseau considered it useless to convince a child if you cannot also persuade him. Be like, children can believe things. Be like, yeah, I believe it, but I'm still going to do the thing I was doing before. So you're doing some kind of like moral lesson with the child. Be like, so now that we've had this talk, are you convinced that it's better to share with your sister? Uh-huh. Okay, so what are you going to go to do? I'm going to go take my stuff back. That's the kind of thing they're talking about. On the other hand, to someone concerned with the rational character of adherence to an argument, convincing is more crucial than persuading. Furthermore, this rational character of conviction depends sometimes on the means used and sometimes on the faculties one addresses. In Pascal's view, persuasion is something applied to the automation. That's a bad translation. I'm not going to look at the French right now. I don't have time to do that. But that doesn't make sense in English, so it must be a bad translation. By which he means, probably the automaton might be a better translation. Like, the idea that there is something automatic in us is actually a really ancient idea. It goes way back, all the way to Aristotle. It's a really old idea. So that's my guess of what they're talking about here. Persuasion is based on things that are kind of not the place where we are reflective. Today they might call it System 1 versus System 2 thinking fast and slow. Persuasion is the fast thinking. Conviction is that deep, slow thinking. So by which he means the body, imagination, and feeling. All in fact that is not reason. You can persuade people in all sorts of ways. Be like, I get persuaded when I go to the mall to buy an Annie Ann's pretzels because it smells good. It's persuasion. Be like, cinnamon sugar. Ooh, yum. Let me go that way. Often and I'm acting, right? Sort of. Often persuasion is considered to be an unwarranted transposition of demonstration. Thus, according to Dumas, in being persuaded, a person is satisfied with affective and personal reasons. Affective, emotional reasons. Be like, yeah, that's kind of what I want to do. I want to eat some Annie Ann's. Who are you to tell me not to? And persuasion is often sophistic, which is just a bad word, obviously, if you're a philosopher. But he does not specify in what respect this affective proof differs technically from objective proof. They're like, okay, so why is this proof bad? Has anyone bothered to think about that? Seems kind of emotional, bro. Seems kind of an emotional position to say that emotion is clearly worse evidence or worse proof than what you're calling objective. What's your objective basis for that? They're kind of doing this thing. The criteria relied on to distinguish between conviction and persuasion are always based on a decision requiring isolation from totality of procedures, totality of faculties, of certain elements conceived as rational. We could just say here, too long didn't read, context. Separated from context. This process of isolation, it must be emphasized, is sometimes applied to the actual lines of reasoning. It may be shown, for instance, that a certain syllogism, while inducing conviction, will not induce persuasion. So, you can kind of move someone through the steps of a proof, but they're like, at the end of it, they're like, yeah, sure, but I still don't buy it. And there's perfectly reasonable reasons that people would do that. Be like, well, if you accept all these premises, this follows. You're like, yeah, I'm not. I mean, I know I said yes to those, but something about it is, I don't buy it. There must be a problem somewhere. I don't know where it is. But my feeling is different than just what you've proven. I just don't buy it. However, this way of speaking of a syllogism involves isolating it from an entire context. See, they use the word too. It supposes that the premises of the syllogism exist in the mind independently of the remainder. It transforms these premises into intangible and unshakable truths. You have to accept all the premises of the argument to see the logical conclusion of it. If you keep saying, like, well, I'm not sure if that premise is true. Socrates is mortal? We don't know. I want some more evidence. Where's the DNA? We're going in a different direction. And a lot of people think of that as like also very logical. People will go around and be like, I'm doing logical arguments. My arguments are logical. This is, I think, a relatively modern way of approaching logic, where logic is just the name for a norm of reasoning. And I was just reading something before the stream where people were like, not so always so hot on logic. If you called someone's argument logical, in certain contexts, at certain times, they would be like, embarrassing. You're just logic chopping. You're just kind of doing this schoolroom activity. You're not involved in the serious, inquiry into the issue here. Scientific inquiry, political inquiry. You're just kind of going through the motions. You're doing debate club in the bad sense, kind of thing. That's kind of the accusation there. So it's weird that today it's like logic just means my arguments are good. That's all that it means when people say it. A lot of the time, they're like, well, I'm being logical. I'm right. We may be told, for example, that a certain person, although convinced of the dangers of too rapid mastication, this means chewing, will not on that account cease the practice. Someone in a previous class was like, we were doing a glossary of all the weird terms, and she was like, what's mastication? I was like, chewing. She said, well, why don't they say it that way? Good point. Again, but probably bad translation choice. I really don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be funny, though, because if you use like sometimes highfalutin words for things that can be said simply, you're kind of like doing a little voice, but it's hard to read that in this. So, there's some translation issues, unfortunately, with this text. Such a statement involves isolation from the complete picture of the reasoning which forms the basis of the conviction, of one's conviction, we might say. It is overlooked, for instance, that this conviction may run up against another conviction, affirming that time is gained by eating more quickly. It is apparent, then, that the concept of what constitutes conviction, though seemingly based on a singling out of the means of proof used or faculties called into play, often also involves the isolation of particular data from a far more complex totality. I have to kind of narrow things. I have to make them really specific in order to do all these kind of logical things and say, aha, at the end, you see, I've got you. Je t'aime. I got you. You're already playing a kind of artificial game. And people can do that. And when people intersubjectively agree to do that, they're like, okay, let's see where this goes. They might be doing something that's kind of interesting or even pleasurable. But a lot of times people will kind of force that on you. They'll approach you and they'll be like, no, you got to follow these rules of logic. You have to accept my narrowing of the context to what I have already decided is relevant. That's the only way to play my game. One of the guys that did this was Socrates. And so dialectic gets kind of thought about in terms of what Socrates is doing, but that's not the only way to understand dialectic. What if both people in the game could kind of bring in whatever they thought was relevant and ask questions to the other person? Socrates doesn't play that game, right? So people who go around and try to be Socrates, they're often forcing norms on, but acting as if they're not. They're like, no, these are universal norms that we're talking about. That's kind of what they do, because if we talk about a subject in the universal context of logic, It must have be universal rules. This is totally false inference. It's bad logic. However, even if one refuses, as we do, to adopt these distinctions in actual thought, one must recognize that our language makes use of two notions, convincing and persuading. And so does English, helpfully. So, okay, great. And that there is a slight and perceptible difference in the meaning of the two terms. We're going to apply the term persuasive to argumentation that only claims validity for a particular audience, and the term convincing to argumentation that presumes to gain the adherence of every rational being. Notice that little word. They're not being saucy here by being like, oh yeah, only presumes. This is a part of the concept that they're trying to articulate, and that the universal audience is going to articulate too. It's that I am representing my argument as I make it, in speech, in writing, in whatever form I'm doing it. I can represent my audience as applying to a particular place and time. Like right now, in this context, with you and me here, huddled by this candle. Can you hear the candle? It's supposed to make a nice noise. I don't know if you can hear it or not. Let me know. There's certain things that apply. I'm doing persuading because I'm showing you that's what I'm doing. If I am like, well, certainly anyone would believe the following, even if we find people that don't believe it, I'm still, in terms of how I'm representing my argument, doing convincing. I'm going about it in that way. And we can think about it from the same perspective. If an audience understands the reason that it believes these things as being universal, then they are being convinced. Whereas if they're like, okay, that makes sense to me based on my experiences, things that are, local to me, to what I know, maybe other people in my community, things like that. Yeah, I'm persuaded. That's how I am understanding my own relationship to the argument. So every person believes in a set of facts, of truths, which he thinks must be accepted by every normal person because they are valid for every rational being. But is this really the case? Does not this claim to an absolute validity for any audience composed of rational beings go too far? On this point, even the most conscientious writer can do more than submit to the test of facts, to his reader's judgment. In any case, he will have done all he can to convince, if he thinks he is validly addressing such an audience. So a lot of people here at this point have kind of understood what they're about to do with the universal audience to be a weird answer to this question. This is clearly not what they're saying. But some people are being like, no, surely there is an audience that really exists that can be thought of as the truths that everyone would accept. That's not what they're saying. They're not talking about the existence of such an audience. They're talking about people presuming to argue to such an audience, which people do all the time. Whenever they say things like, oh yeah, well, everyone, obviously the world is round. This is the one that people always go to. And then you can very easily kind of do this boring back and forth. You're like, well, what about the Flat Earth Society? And then people will often go immediately to this other weird philosophical consideration. Like, well, is something true if it's not believed by everyone? It's like, sure. Depending on what you mean by truth. But that's a weird place to go. In rhetoric, it's much easier. Just being like, well, we are considering it reasonable to believe it that way. We're saying that this is one of the criteria that we would make for a reasonable audience. And if someone doesn't buy it, they're not in the universal audience. There are probably plenty of people that wouldn't be in anyone's universal audience. So it's a weird concept because it's an imagination of everybody that happily excludes all sorts of people. Happily does it. That's a weird way to describe it, but we'll do it from a few different angles. Despite the similarity in their consequences, we prefer our criterion to that, quite different in principle, put forward by Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, this is kind of an important book, or was at some point. Maybe it's not that important anymore, but some Italian guy says it's not, so maybe he's right. I don't know. Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. According to him, conviction and persuasion are two different kinds of belief. So this is a long quote from Kant, which I guess I am going to read. If a judgment is valid for every rational being, then its ground is objectively sufficient. But also notice that if a judgment is valid, some people will, if you're in my class, we'll talk more about validity when we get to the logician as a perspective on argument. And validity does not mean truth. Validity means soundness of inference. Well, it doesn't mean soundness because that's a different thing, but in terms of the non-technical language that we can use, being like, validity means you followed all of the steps. If these premises are true, this follows. I followed all of the steps correctly. But the premises could be wrong. There could be other things in the world that would show us to be wrong. But we reasoned in a valid way about it. So validity is not truth because of that distinction. If, on the other hand, it has its grounds in the particular character of the subject, the person doing the inferencing, it is termed a persuasion. Persuasion is a mere illusion, the ground of the judgment, which lies solely in the subject being regarded as objective. So Kant is like anything where you come into it, illusion. That's a lot of people say today. A lot of people say this today. They're like, oh yeah, but that's just subjective. That's subjective. They don't even say that's just subjective. They're like, that's subjective. If something's subjective, not to be considered at all. This is how people represent their positions. Very weird. Why would the subjective not matter? It seems to matter to a lot of arguments. Like, who are we? Where are we from? What's our experience? This matters to a huge number of arguments. It's totally crucial. So, but anyway, Kant's up to his own philosophical project here. Hence, a judgment of this kind has only private validity, is only valid for the individual who judges, and the holding of a thing to be true in this way cannot be communicated. So you have your truth, I have mine. Everybody be themselves. Persuasion, accordingly, cannot be subjectively distinguished from conviction. That is, so long as the subject views its judgment simply as a phenomenon of its own mind. It's happening in my head. But if we inquire whether the grounds of our judgment, which are valid for us, produce the same effect on the reason of others as on our own, we have then the means, though only subjective means, not indeed of producing conviction, but of detecting the merely private validity of the judgment. Be like, oh yeah, you would say that. You would say that. That's a private judgment you're making. That's not a universal judgment. It's private. In other words, of discovering that there is in it the element of mere persuasion. Persuasion I may keep for myself if it is agreeable to me, but I cannot and ought not to attempt to impose it as binding upon others. Interesting. So this has been a long-held, not by all philosophers, but a long-held European philosophical view since the time that Kant wrote it, but really also before it by many people. It was just kind of most fully and clearly expressed by him. Persuasion doesn't count. It's not part of reason. It's not just that it's not valid or true. It's not part of reason. If you're persuaded by something, it's biology or it's imagination. It's something that we are going to say is a capacity of the human being that is not reasonable. And you could even take it as far to say it is irrational, and some people have. So there's this huge bias in favor of reason over unreason. And all sorts of things were thought of as being unreasonable. Anything that didn't have a universal ground to it. Is Kant the original STEM bro, maybe? I don't know. I mean, he had interesting things to say. He had some pretty horrible things to say, too. He had a lot of things to say. He wrote a lot of stuff. The Kantian view, I one time was kind of in an argument with someone because he was like, we should burn Kant. And I was like, I think that's a little far. I think it might be useful to not burn the Kant, read the Kant a little bit. But some people have really strong opinions about this guy. The Kantian view, though rather close to ours in its consequences, differs from it, making the opposition of subjective and objective its criterion for distinguishing between persuasion and conviction. If conviction is based on the truth of its object and is thereby valid for every rational being, then conviction alone can be proved, and persuasion has no more than individual significance. From this it is clear that Kant accepts only purely logical proof, and excludes from philosophy all argument that does not absolutely compel acceptance. It's weird how so many people were not compelled by Kant's arguments. No, okay. That's a low blow. That's not fair. Kant's conception is defensible only if it is conceded that what is not necessary is not communicable. And this would exclude all argumentation directed to particular audiences. But argumentation of the latter kind is the chosen sphere of rhetoric. And from the moment one admits the existence of other means of proof than necessary proof, argumentation addressed to particular audience assumes a significance beyond mere subjective belief. So they're disagreeing here with Kant because they're saying if you exclude all of these particular audiences and you get rid of rhetoric entirely, which is kind of what Kant is trying to do. He's trying to purge philosophy from all of its rhetorical elements, kind of like bad conscience of philosophy, or like maybe it was not so dramatic. You could just say philosophy is like a bad traveler. That person that you go on a trip with and they might be a really good travel companion, but they just pack too much stuff. They bring way too much stuff. Like, why do you have 12 pairs of shoes? You're gone for a week. It's just way too much. Maybe philosophy was like this. So from Kant's perspective, all of these elements that historically had been part of philosophy, they needed to be shown not to be the kind of proper object of philosophy, which for him was everything, included speculative philosophy in some sense, which he was trying to put limits on, but it included most of the sciences, basically all the stuff that you would do in school would be considered a branch off of philosophy or part of philosophy. So rhetoric, that's like home ec class. That's a way down the ladder. All this kind of stuff. You're never going to touch that in a kind of serious conversation. Serious people are not interested in that kind of stuff. And I did choose a kind of gendered class for a reason. This is a very gendered argument. It's been around for a long time, where rhetoric is kind of feminized and made into sometimes a kind of image of things that are useless, deceitful, treacherous, all sorts of things that are really close to the misogynistic epithets that people would use to describe women in patriarchal cultures. It's such a weird relationship. Why would that be? Is it just a coincidence? Because oftentimes they talk about it not with misogynistic metaphors directly. It's a really weird kind of thing that keeps happening in the history of philosophy. It might be worth thinking about that too. Why is that? Why does it go along with the misogynistic attitudes so frequently in history? I think there might be something to that. And from the moment one admits the existence of other means of proof, the necessary proof, argumentation addressed to particular audiences assumes a significance beyond mere subjective belief. Okay, I already read that part. The distinction that we propose between persuasion and conviction expresses indirectly the connection that is frequently established, on one hand, between persuasion and action, and on the other hand, between conviction and intelligence. Indeed, the timeless character of certain audiences explains why arguments addressed to them make no call for immediate action. So the kinds of things you can argue to a universal audience about can't be like current events. Because the future of the universe hopefully is still not concerned. I mean, given the news of the moment I'm making this, sometimes current events do feel like they might be eternal issues in a kind of depressing way. But we don't want that to be the kind of focus of it. We don't want it to be this kind of weird rationality that we apply to everything, to be the way that we address the topics of our own life and time, our historical time. At first sight, this distinction based on the characteristics of the audience does not seem to explain the difference between conviction and persuasion as it is experienced by the hearer himself or herself. But it will readily be seen that the same criterion can nevertheless apply if one bears in mind that the hearer imagines the transfer to other audiences of the arguments presented to him, and that he concerns himself with the reception they would obtain. Our viewpoint has the advantage of showing that the difference between the terms convincing and persuading is always unprecise, and in practice must remain so. For whereas the frontier between intelligence and will, between reason and the irrational, can be clearly drawn, the making of distinctions between different audiences is a far less certain matter. Am I talking right now to the Twitch audience, or is it maybe actually not a Twitch audience, people who have come to this who are not the usual Twitch audience? Or is it men and women 18 to 35? Is it kind of advertising type of demographic? Well, what if someone's not in that demographic and they happen upon it and they form their own opinions, even if those opinions are very different from the other demographic? How do we draw these lines between audiences? They don't think that maybe the way to do it is there might be a better way to do it. Was what they're going to. So they kind of talk here in a very roundabout way, I would say. But they have some concerns with the audience they're addressing that don't exist for us, like things like where we would draw the frontier between intelligence and will. I just don't think is a kind of live concern right now. But at a certain time, and with this audience, it might have been. It might have been in a certain kind of academic psychology or moral philosophy. The distinction we make between persuading and convincing has many features in common with the distinctions made by writers in the past, even though we have not adopted their criteria. It also explains the use that some writers make out of modesty of the word persuasion as opposed to conviction. For instance, Claparède, in the preface to one of his books, tells us that his decision to let the manuscript see the light of day was in accession to the request of Madame Antipaff, who persuaded, but did not convince me, that the publication of these investigations was desirable. So this is part of... There's too many weird things to explain here. These are really weird examples. This is one of the problems that people who want to teach this book have, being like, how do you make sense of any of these examples? It's like you have to do a whole separate lecture on it. So that's why I do these streams. But we don't have to understand all of these references. I think it's better to just kind of realize, I don't know what they're talking about. But here he's referring to a pretty common practice in, let's say the 17th century, where someone would write at the beginning of a book a long dedication. Today, I have a dedication page like, to my parents. It'll be 3 words or something like that. It's very short, terse, in good taste. I much prefer the contemporary practice to the old-timey one, which would write these long, often kind of flattering, sycophantic letters to usually a patron or someone that, was maybe an important friend. Maybe sometimes it was sincere at some level, but it's very kind of high, inflated rhetoric about the importance of this person to the book. And often they would do this thing called a modesty topos. They would say, I didn't really even want to publish the book, but you forced me to. You begged me so for this book. I think it's full of flaws, but I put it out before the public at your behest. Because there's a weird sense of shame that people have when they're directly addressing a public at this time. To kind of directly ask for people's attention at the public scale is considered maybe kind of in bad taste. So you'd have to do all these weird workarounds. So here, he's saying this kind of request to publish his work, coming from this madam, persuaded but did not convince me. She's like, it wasn't a rational argument that she used to put out this book. This book really, she persuaded me through friendship, but really this book is still not so good. And, I'm ashamed of it. It has flaws. It's part of this weird modesty topos. But they're just using this as an example of how persuasion and conviction might be distinguished. What kinds of attitudes go when we use those two different words. In so writing, the author has no thought of making a theoretical distinction between the two terms, but he makes use of the difference between them to express both the slight guaranteed objective value and the power of the reasons given by his collaborator. The difference in shades of meaning conveyed by Claparède may correspond to the Kantian concept, but seems to fit in even better with the fact that he was confronted with reasons that were convincing to him, but which he thought might not be convincing to everybody. So there's the big distinction. Be like, yeah, I buy it, not sure my neighbor would. This is this distinction between being persuaded and then being like, everyone should buy into this. That's convincing. Okay. Thus, the nature of the audience to which arguments can be successfully presented will determine to a great extent both the direction the arguments will take and the character, the significance that will be attributed to them. What formulation can we make of audiences which have come to play a normative role, enabling us to judge on the convincing character of an argument? So the normative role here means that there's a kind of force about how argument should go. That we're thinking about audiences not only to describe an argument, what it's like, what its audience is, but to say, does it meet the standards of its audience? Kind of rhetorical judgment being made there. I would say that maybe one of the things that really distinguishes rhetoric as a tradition of thinking about the world from philosophy is really that one of taking standards that might even be moral standards, but making them related to a particular group. Does that action meet the standards of this group rather than the standards that are universal and absolute for all time and all places? There's much more comfort in the rhetorical tradition with taking standards that are kind of particular and local. Okay, I think I've made that point a fair bit. 3 kinds of audiences are apparently regarded as enjoying special prerogatives, perks, as regards this function, both in practice and in the view of philosophers. So the first such audience consists of the whole of mankind, or at least of all normal adult persons. It sounds a lot harsher than I think they mean it. Normal adult persons. I'm not sure I fit that category without any qualifiers. Normal adults. But I think they just mean, you could probably think of an exception, be kind of annoying and being like, what about someone who is alive but brain dead or things like that? But we're not going to consider those cases. We shall refer to it as the universal audience. So here they go. They introduced their famous term, the universal audience. An audience of the whole of mankind. I think one of the things that's a problem with how people have read this historically is they don't read this section. They just go right to the section called the universal audience, which is the next section. But they spend a lot of time setting it up here. And this is part of the style of reasoning that they're using. That they're this is a big, long preface. This is like the overture to their book. This whole first section of the book, these first 12 or 13 sections, I don't know how many there are, maybe 14 sections. Yeah, I think it's the first 14 sections are like prelude music. They're setting out all these important concepts and attitudes, and they're doing it with all this kind of detail and these weird examples from French literature and history. It's really kind of like a different style than I think a lot of, especially American audiences, are used to reading, where you're like, what's the concept? Go to the place where it says the concept, and you're going to define it for me. It's not what they're doing. So they're really setting up all of this stuff that's important to understand what they mean by universal audience. And they're doing it in the section before it. Sometimes it's a different style. So the second consists of the single interlocutor whom a speaker addresses in a dialogue, and the third is the subject himself when he deliberates or gives himself reasons for his actions. So we might kind of look at this here and say, if you're in my class, go back across some of the things that we do. If you're talking about the universal audience, you're appealing to a kind of a logician's imagination of an audience. The single interlocutor, that might be more like the dialectical attitude towards argument. And the subject, myself, when I'm reasoning to myself, it's not exactly pure logic that's doing that, but it's a kind of internal dialogue that maybe looks like reason, what a lot of people call reason, the way that I think in my head to myself. We hasten to add that it is only when the interlocutor in a dialogue and the man debating with himself are regarded as an incarnation of the universal audience that they enjoy the philosophic privilege conferred to reason, by virtue of which argumentation addressed to them has often been assimilated to logical discourse. Each speaker's universal audience can, indeed, from an external viewpoint, be regarded as a particular audience. So that's such a weird sentence. Think about that. Each speaker's universal audience. So first of all, everyone has their own universal audience, right? They're not just imagining pure logic here at all. Very different kind of thing. It's an assumption a speaker is making about the kind of form of reasoning that they think represents universality. Can, from an external viewpoint, be regarded as a particular audience. So, but I can look at somebody else doing that and be like, yeah, you think you're talking to everybody. You're just talking to other philosophers. Or you're just talking to other people of your class. You're not talking the way that, you're not thinking or reasoning or talking the way that I would. It's different for me, so I can see it as an external person. That you think you're talking to everybody, you're just talking to a group that I can identify. And a lot of good comedy comes from this interaction, where someone kind of imagines themselves as being at this grand scale, and somebody else kind of is looking like, oh, the emperor has no clothes. A lot of that kind of hot comedy you can find. But it nonetheless remains true that for each speaker at each moment, there exists an audience transcending all others, which cannot easily be forced within the bounds of a particular audience. On the other hand, the interlocutor in a dialogue or the persons engaged in deliberation can be considered as a particular audience, with reactions that are known to us, or at least with characteristics we can study. Hence the primordial importance of the universal audience as providing a norm for objective argumentation, since the other party to a dialogue and the person deliberating with himself can never amount to more than floating incarnations of this universal audience. It gets kind of a little mystical there at the end. Floating incarnations of the universal audience. So the actual audience in front of you looks different once you think about the universal audience. That they kind of, as an ideal, are the universal audience, if they heard it in a certain way. Whereas you might recognize, be like, well, that's not what's really going on in people's minds. Not everybody's doing this ideal of the audience that I have in my mind. So dealing with that difference between an ideal audience and a real audience is another way to think about what the universal audience is. That ideal audience is the universal one for everybody, whatever that your ideal is. You're imagining people acting as and thinking in a certain way based on the arguments that you make. Usually we want people to agree with us, right? We represent reason as being kind of the position we inhabit, even though we might be aware, we're like, I don't really know, and maybe there are other perspectives that matter. You still kind of represent, when you're reasoning for a position, that you have the reasonable position. Okay, so 7. Here's the big time one, the universal audience. Argumentation aimed exclusively at a particular audience. It only took me almost 40 minutes to do the one section, so I need to go a little faster, but this is an important section, so I'm going to spend some time with this one as well. This is a really probably a crucial concept for the whole book, the new Rhetoric, but also I think for thinking about rhetoric and argumentation. It's really hard to think about rhetoric's argumentation as not just being kind of these weird collections that people have made about really particular audiences, unless you have a concept like this, I think. So understanding it can be very useful if you want to think about argument rhetorically. Okay, so 7, the universal audience. Argumentation aimed exclusively at a particular audience has the drawback that the speaker, by the very fact of adapting to the views of his listeners, might rely on arguments that are foreign or even directly opposed to what is acceptable to persons other than those he is presently addressing. Pandering. The danger is apparent in the case of a composite audience, which the speaker has to resolve into its constituent parts for the purposes of his argumentation. I'm speaking to the government and the opposition at the same time in Parliament, something like that. So I have to kind of make two speeches in one. For a composite audience, such as a parliamentary assembly will have to be regrouped as a single entity to make a decision, and it is extremely easy for the opponent of an incautious speaker to turn against him all the arguments he directed to the different parts of the audience, either by setting the arguments against each other so as to show that their incompatibility, or by presenting them to those they were not meant for. This explains the relative weakness of arguments that are accepted only by particular audiences, and the value attached to opinions that enjoy unanimous approval, particularly approval by persons or groups who agree on very few matters. So when someone makes an argument, sort of like, that's something that Democrats and Republicans could accept. Conservatives and liberals can think about, can agree on this issue. That is, for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, a certain kind of ideal of argument. Be like, what would be the common ground thing we could all agree on? What is that? Naturally, the value of this unanimity depends on the number and quality of those expressing it. Its highest point is reached when there is agreement of the universal audience. Right? So this is an ideal. This is like Boyle's law. This never happens in reality. There is never an agreement of a universal audience, meaning everyone at all times and places. It's never happened. It never will happen. It doesn't need to happen. It's okay. But we might have that ideal and see the difference between things. We understand our own situation a little better. Oh, we are kind of always going in that direction, aren't we? Don't we want arguments to be able to kind of be useful in more contexts? I think for a lot of people, that is desirable. Well, I want the argument that works in lots of different places. What does that look like? Well, the ideal of it would be the argument that works in all contexts for everybody. This refers, of course, in this case, not to an experimentally proven fact, but to a universality and unanimity imagined by the speaker, to the agreement of an audience which should be universal, since for legitimate reasons we need not take into consideration those which are not a part of it. Universal audience, not so universal. Philosophers always claim to be addressing such an audience, not because they hope to obtain the effective assent of all men or women. They know very well that only a small minority will ever read their works, but because they think that all who understand the reasons they give will have to accept their conclusions. So if we're going back to the previous section, they're doing convincing. They're in the business of convincing. So a philosopher might be writing for literally 4 or 5 people in the world who are going to read this, highly technical work. But they write it as if they're writing to a universal audience. These are the arguments that anyone should be able to accept, that everyone should accept. So this is something that defines philosophical discourse, is that it always adopts the universal audience as its audience. And they don't agree very much, famously. Philosophers love to disagree with each other. The agreement of a universal audience is thus a matter not of fact, but of right. The basis for relying on the adherence of those who submit to the data of experience, or to the light shed by reason, is the speaker's affirmation of that which corresponds to an objective fact, of that which constitutes a true and even necessary assertion. So they're saying something weird here. They're both saying, we're not asking the question, is what someone believes true? That's not what we're asking. We're saying, how does truth, an assumption of truth, function within people's beliefs when they are arguing? And the things that people assume have to be true give you an image of their audience. So it's weird. We tend to think of audience as something outside of us, and that's an important part of the concept of audiences. Yeah, it's real. It's you right now, audience for this. It's a part of human communication, is that external reality of other people, other minds. That does happen. But at the same time, there's also sorry, I just got a phone call, so I lost my train of thought. But the internal reality of the audience, which is how you're representing it to yourself. And it's actually where, for Keim and Lucy, where we really understand audience better, because we can see it in the arguments that people make. Even if we don't know who was in the room when they made them, it doesn't really matter. We can understand who they were appealing to based on how we understand the argument and its structure and its arrangement, what it values, what it represents as true and inarguable. That's where we see the audience. Okay. In fact, a judgment of this sort is deemed to be binding on everybody because the speaker himself is convinced that it does not admit of any question. Right? These are the assumptions. This Cartesian attitude has been described very expressively by Dumas. I'm just going to skip that because we don't need to know all of that. Rationalism, with its claim to completely eliminate rhetoric from philosophy, announced a very ambitious program which would bring about the agreement of minds through universal yielding to rational self-evidence. But the exigencies of the Cartesian method had hardly been stated when Descartes, in the name of these exigencies, made some very questionable assertions. Okay, so we need to talk maybe a little bit about the Descartes thing. Why is that coming up? Because, Descartes makes this famous pronouncement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Yeah, he makes this pronouncement. And he says, well, I'm going to derive all of knowledge from that one certain premise. Everything else can be kind of deductively arrived at. And he goes really far with this. He doesn't just stop at these kind of philosophical reflections. He bases a geometry on it and an optics on it. He bases various sciences on this argument, later down the road, looking at his work completely. So sometimes I used to get confused. People talk about Descartes, like, Descartes. Why is that argument such a big deal? Who cares? I mean, you either believed it or you didn't, or you saw this rational demonstration. Cool. What, beyond philosophy, did it matter at all? Well, I think it is maybe overstated a bit how important this Cartesian moment was, but you can see it as a new moment in the project of rationality, where rationality is going to be the universal way of thinking for all things at all time. There must be some method that has to be discovered, maybe even experimentally, a method that has to be discovered that will allow you to do deductive reasoning in all of the sciences, in all, maybe ambitiously in all human activity could become rational. This became like a hope or a desire for many people. Not everyone, but for many people, this was a hope or a desire. So that's what they're responding to here. How indeed does one distinguish between true and false self-evidence? Does a person suppose that there is really objective validity in what convinces a universal audience, of which he considers himself the ideal representative? Pareto has made the penetrating observation that the universal consensus invoked is often merely the unwarranted generalization of an individual intuition. Yeah, good job, Pareto. He was an economist or something. For this reason, it is always hazardous for a writer or speaker to identify with logic the argumentation intended for the universal audience, as he himself has conceived it. The concepts that men have formed in the course of history of objective facts and obvious truths have sufficiently varied for us to be wary in this matter. And it's wary, not weary. Wary in this matter. Yeah, so he's like, yeah, sure, go look historically at all the things people said, well, this is an obvious objective truth. It keeps changing. So you might really think, you're like, well, okay, but now we're right. Fine, even if that's the case. You can't then argue that what people think is self-evident is the reason that something is true, because it has had to be corrected so many times. So self-evidence is this problem, things that people assume. But all arguments have to assume things. So we're not going to get out of this problem in some kind of methodical way here. It's probably a good thing to assume. They are not believers in the Cartesian method, you could say. The concepts that men have formed, Everyone constitutes the universal audience for what he knows of his fellow men in such a way as to transcend the few oppositions he is aware of. Each individual, each culture has thus its own conception of the universal audience. Again, weird. Universal audience is not very universal. Every culture has its own universal audience, and within that, there are probably more deviations and specifications, how people represent to themselves what everyone would believe. If you're in my classes, we read Bohannon's Shakespeare in the Bush, and this is a good example from a different perspective of what people thought would have to be true for everyone, and everyone in the story is wrong about it. The British person who thinks that Shakespeare can't be understood by others because he's very, very British, right? He's like, it doesn't amount to universality. The American woman who's like, Shakespeare is universal, so she's an anthropologist living with the Tiv tribe, and she's like, well, the Tiv I'll tell them the story and they'll understand it. And then she tells them the story and they're like, no, you don't understand your own story. You got it wrong. That can't be, because these things have to hold about how society is, how the world is. So everybody's bringing these false conceptions. Again, a lot of good humor and comedy comes from this, the comedy of errors. Literally the idea of the humors. We all have different humors in our body. And so there's something that we just can't see about the other perspective. This is a good kind of comic framing of things. The study of these variations would be very instructive, as we would learn from it what men, at different times in history, have regarded as real, true, and objectively valid. So you could say this is what some intellectual historians are doing. Being like, I'm telling the history of what people used to think was real, true, and objectively valid. And that's an interesting story, even in its own right. But it might also tell us some things about our own sense of what we think is real, true, and valid. If argumentation addressed to the universal audience and calculated to convince does not convince everybody, one can always resort to disqualifying the recalcitrant by classifying him as stupid or abnormal. Being like, yeah, well, I mean, what are you going to say? So they're like, yeah, you can throw out people. And they're not saying this is what you should do. They're kind of backing away from exactly what you should do in your life. It's not a self-help book. It might help you. You might be able to help yourself, but it's not a self-help book. It's not taking that position. It's just like, this is what people do when they represent the universal audience themselves. Because someone's like, well, what about all the people that are flat earthers? Well, people immediately always say, again, in this so tedious and typical back and forth, but important to rehearse these positions, maybe, where someone goes, yeah, but those people are stupid. Flat earthers are stupid. What can you say? One of the weird things about the flat earthers is, I haven't dug super deep into the flat earth. Don't want to come out the other end. But one of the weird things with the flat earthers is they have a quite elaborate ideology, and they have branching different ones. But a large part of the flat earth community, so to speak, has an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory behind it. So these beliefs also don't mean the things that they appear to mean. Like, once you start looking at the context, you discover this whole network of stuff, of values, of truths that don't seem obvious if you just look at a certain piece of argumentation. If you look at its internal validity, you might say it's false, but you're never going to get to this other stuff of like what's motivating it. Very different kind of perspective to take on argument. This approach, common among thinkers in the Middle Ages, is also used by some modern writers. So he's here pointing again, to some intellectual historians. But, you probably have heard people do this in contemporary life, but maybe some of the medieval thinkers would be things like, well, the people that disagree with us are Muslims and Jews, so obviously we don't have to consider their position. They're infidels. So you could call someone an infidel and just be like, in my theological argument, obviously the truths that we begin with are the truths of our faith. We're not considering those other positions. And then when people did, so for instance, this guy Baudin, who was a French writer in the 16th century, wrote a book where you did hear all of these different religious positions actually encountering each other. It was very weird and controversial. People were like, that's a weird way to do that. That doesn't mean we might not come out on top if you keep going in that direction, right? Like, it makes people a little uncomfortable. There can only be adherence to this idea of excluding individuals from the human community if the number and intellectual value of those banned are not so high as to make a procedure ridiculous. If this danger exists, recourse must be had to another line of argumentation, and the universal audience must be set against an elite audience endowed with exceptional and infallible means of knowledge. Those who provide themselves on possession of a supernatural revelation or mystical knowledge, as well as to those who appeal to the virtuous, to believers, or to men endowed with grace, show their preference for an elite audience. This elite audience may even be confused with the perfect being. They're making a lot of arguments there all at once. But I would say one way to understand this idea of the elite audience that they're talking about here is that I want to be talking to the elite audience. So part of my argument is I'm telling my audience, my real audience, that they are already the ideal or the elite, or that they need to do certain things in order to achieve that ideal sense of rationality or reason or faith or whatever it is that is the norm that I'm representing as what's the elite norm. What do you have to do to achieve it? Or we already have achieved that, so what does that mean for us? Excluding other people who have not yet achieved it. So this is a really powerful thing in a lot of, you could say, cults. You could see this in Scientology, that a huge part of Scientology is about creating a tiered system where you have to kind of continuously give more and more money and time and sacrifices to the church in order to kind of keep going up levels in Scientology. You have to kind of keep going up, keep moving, because you're trying to become clear. Only the clear, those who go clear, who are thetanless, can have the true insight, knowledge, understanding, and ability to lead, all these kinds of things. And so even if you have not yet achieved, in this case, achieved your own going clear, that you might be being appealed to in a Scientology conference or something as an elite audience because you're striving for the right ideal. You're on the path. Keep giving more money. But those who are outside, those of the world who we have cursed against us, they're not the ideal. They must be shunned and turned away from, or whatever the attitude is of that particular body. Okay. But again, when they say elite audience, it's not their own opinion that these people are elite. This is how the audience is being represented to itself. But also, But often also the elite audience is regarded as a model to which men should conform in order to be worthy of the name. In other words, the elite audience sets the norm for everybody. In this case, the elite is the vanguard all will follow and conform to. You too can go clear. Be like L. Ron Hubbard. In this case, the elite, its opinion is the only one that matters, for in the final analysis, it is the determining one. So what's the good kind of opinion? And you might be like, maybe I use an example that for some people will be easy to kind of dismiss, because they're like, that's so ridiculous. Scientologists are, ready drum roll, stupid. We just exclude them from our own understanding of a universal audience, something like that. I mean, I don't actually believe that. I don't think that's the case at all. But a lot of people would. They would say that about Scientologists, for instance. But what about just how we talk in our political arguments all the time? When we're like, those people are crazy or stupid, or they won't understand reason, or they're beyond hope. They're indoctrinated. They're programmed. They need to be re-educated. There are some people that are deplorable. There's some people that are disgusting. There's some people that are animal humans, whose opinion only does them wrong, only shows how stupid or evil or whatever they are. So this is a really important part of rhetoric, is hate. Rhetorical hate creates audiences because it divides you from one. Your identification with that hateful kind of sense excludes other people and makes an audience appear. Hate's a really taboo subject, maybe for good reason. And sometimes people will make gestures of talking about hate, but it's always, they always do it from this perspective of an elite audience. Every time someone talks about hate, they talk about hate to an elite audience. They're like, we need to talk about hate. It's a real problem. We need to work through it because other people hate. We don't hate. It's very difficult to talk to an audience, to have them identify with their own hate as a problem. Really hard to do. Because at that moment, an audience is thinking about itself negatively. And it's starting to kind of divide itself. Be like, well, I don't want to be that. I don't want to identify with this flaw. So can I create a different position? And now there's the thing that you are talking about as a speaker and the thing that I am. We have two audiences now. But I think it might be an important part of one of the reasons why this book in particular is, I think, still new and fresh, is it really has some practical things. You know, it doesn't feel practical when you read it. There's all these complicated metaphors and all these like weird concerns that we just don't share. It has this prose style that's difficult, but it's really practical once you've absorbed some of its context to be able to use. Be like, how could I do that? How could I get to an effect? That's what we actually wanted to do. We wanted to change who we were, how we identified ourselves as an audience for our lives, for our nations, for whatever. How can we do that in a way where people will actually be persuaded or moved by that? What's involved in doing that? This is not kind of like a set plan for how to do that, but it gives you some of the things that you might need to think about, I think. So I find it really valuable. I am kind of feeling this in the moment that I'm in right now, or that this video, the time this video is made in, as you know, the recent declaration of war by Israel on Hamas, and after Hamas's invasion or escape. I don't know how to term this. The words, the language, it's such a fresh controversy in our current world right now that the language hasn't settled on it. It's also very old and involved in complex controversy that it's part of a history of. So I think this kind of rich, very much more elaborated kind of argumentation theory actually has a lot of purchase at this moment. How do we have to spend time thinking about how we engage each other in argumentation. What's the purposes of it? What we're trying to do in that? Because it's an act that's part of all of our lives, and maybe more is determined by it than we think. How we relate to each other in argument. Okay, enough sermonizing. The elite audience embodies the universal audience only for those who acknowledge this role of vanguard and model. For the rest, it will be no more than a particular audience. The status of an audience varies with the concepts one has of it. Okay. Certain specialized audiences are readily assimilated to the universal audience, such as the audience of the scientist addressing his fellow scientists. The scientist addresses him or herself to certain particularly qualified people who accept the data of a well-defined system consisting of the science in which they are specialists. Yet this very limited audience is generally constituted by the scientist to be really the universal audience, and not just a particular audience. It supposes that everyone with the same training, qualifications, and information would reach the same conclusions. The same holds good when we are dealing with morals. We expect our judgments to be confirmed by the reactions of others. However, the others to whom we appeal are not just any others. We make our appeal solely to those who have duly reflected on the conduct we approve or disapprove of. So we appeal in moral issues to good people, what good people would think or value. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The SART example is just not... it's not fresh right now. So, okay. We believe that the audiences are not independent of one another. That particular concrete audiences are capable of validating a concept of the universal audience which characterizes them. On the other hand, it is the undefined universal audience that is invoked to pass judgment on what is the concept of the universal audience appropriate to such a concrete audience. To examine simultaneously the matter in which it was composed, which are the individuals who comprise it, according to the adopted criterion, whether this criterion is legitimate. It can be said that audiences pass judgment on one another. There's a lot there in that last paragraph, and maybe I'll kind of go back through a couple of these points just before we move on to the next section, because it might be worth thinking about some of the things they are suggesting you can do with this concept right here in this final paragraph. So one of the things they're saying is we don't have to kind of say, we can talk about a concrete audience as distinct from a universal audience. People in the room right now versus an ideal. The distinction can be really easily seen. But they're showing us that there's also a relationship, an important relationship between a concrete audience and universal audience. Every concrete audience, in some sense, is only really an audience when it has its own sense of a universal audience. It understands itself in reference to an ideal. If I just hear your speech as me, I'm just like, well, I'm just going on what I think about it. I don't care about anybody else here, what they think. I'm not really listening to it as an audience member. I'm more back into that single speaker, single hearer thing. I'm kind of putting myself in that position. But oftentimes we do think of ourselves in relationship to, maybe often, maybe always, you decide. But we often think of ourselves in relationship to another, some other, which we might kind of more crisply or more vaguely define for ourselves. Sometimes it would just be kind of like, oh, what will my parents think? It might be that kind of anxiety that comes over you on a Sunday night. You're like, oh, what will my parents think? Oh gosh, how am I doing in school? It's been a little rough, hard to concentrate. What would they think? So that's a kind of moral, more general audience. But sometimes it might not always feel like parents. It would just be like, what would anyone think of me? Might be a kind of way you represent that to yourself. And then maybe it's not just about you. In public, you're like, what would anyone think of this? This scene that's happening right now. Surely any reasonable person would condemn this. Right? We kind of make these movements through different audiences. And that the kind of thought that we have also changes as we change the audience. It's kind of a weird thing, but that's what they're saying the universal audience is. Hopefully, I mean, there's even more to be said about it, but I think that was it was an hour spent on just those two sections. So sorry for the length of time, but these are two really important sections, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to finish them the first time around, but now maybe you can see why I wasn't ready to jump into them. They really are very rich and complex subjects. So hopefully that was helpful, even if it's on 2 times speed. To get through some of that stuff. I think I'm going to take a really short break before we go to the next section, but I'll be back. We're going to go to section 15, and I think I'm actually going to stop the stream and restart it if you are here, because it'll just make it easier for me, because I am lazy and don't like to edit things. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to edit in camera, basically, this Twitch stream. So I'm going to pull this up, take a brief break, and I'll be back in 5 to 7 minutes. But let me get there first. Yes. All right.